want to start with a little thought experiment. I want you to imagine an astrophysicist. Think about what a typical day for that person might be like. Maybe they're sitting at their desk, coming up with a formula to better understand black holes or the origins of the universe. When you were thinking of that person, what did that person look like? If you're like me, this is probably the most immediate image that comes to mind, right? And I know some of you are thinking, is she reading my mind? No, it's not a talk about ESP. I'm sorry to disappoint. But what does this mean that this was a typical image that many of us came up with in our head? It could be an example of an implicit bias we might hold, an automatic association with science as both white and male. And that's not a judgment. It's just the way our brain works. It's a function of us seeing science paired with white and male repeatedly in our textbooks, in our films, and on TV. And if we see these concepts paired enough times, we automatically link them in our head. So you might wonder, what does it matter if I have this automatic association between science and white and male? It matters for a lot of reasons. It matters because our biases affect our behaviors without awareness. If you're a student in a science class and your professor assigns a group project, do you avert your eyes when a woman or person of color looks to you to join your group? If you're a parent, maybe the types of toys you provide your daughters aren't science-focused that allow her to develop her science skills. If you're a teacher, a science teacher, maybe you give a little bit more encouragement to the boys in your class than the girls. And if you're an employer and someone misses something science-related on the interview, maybe you give that person a pass if they're white. But you scrutinize those errors when a Latina makes them. These examples show that our biases affect our attitudes, our perceptions, our memory. And these behaviors are often unintentional, without any malicious intent, but we can begin to see the negative consequences to those behaviors. Women and people of color don't feel like they belong in science classes. Little girls don't learn that science is something they should do or can do. Differential encouragement from teachers translates to higher grades for boys than girls. And white people, more than Latinas, are hired for science jobs. And while I've focused on my example so far on science, of course our biases aren't limited to this context. Imagine meeting someone, and you learn something about maybe their religious affiliation or sexual orientation. Does that automatically trigger feelings of inclusion or exclusion? Our biases can affect day-to-day interactions. Let me give you one example from my life. My cell phone broke, so I went with my brother to buy a new one. And immediately, as soon as we entered that store, that salesperson started treating us like a couple. And they started, I know the women in the room were like, I know where this is going. And immediately directs all the information about the costs and specs of the phone to him, and not me. I was invisible, and I was the one buying the phone. I was mad. But more than being mad, I left without purchasing a cell phone. Our biases have interpersonal costs, but they have financial ones too. In that moment, that salesperson assumed a lot of things about me. That we were a heterosexual couple, and as my husband or boyfriend, he was going to be making that purchasing decision, not me. I'm sure we can all think of an example where we were misread, or we misread someone else. But in addition to our biases affecting these mundane interactions, they can have more severe consequences. People have been killed merely for wearing a hoodie. So if we can agree that our biases lead to poor decisions and ultimately a less fair and just world, what can we do about them? We're not at the mercy of these biases. We can choose to do something else. I'm going to suggest 3 things we all can do to create a more equitable world, a world where everyone has the best shot to thrive. As a first step, we need to acknowledge that we all have biases. And this is hard because when we imagine someone who's biased, we imagine someone who looks like that, right? And we think to ourselves, I'm not like that. I'm a good person with good intentions. I'm not like that guy. We need to step away from equating biases as stemming from evil hearts and minds. Biases are a product of being human, of learning that to quickly navigate my world, I'm going to lump people into categories, and then assume I know something about an individual if I know something about their category. And while that helps me make decisions more quickly, they're not better decisions. So here's another tricky part of this step. As I mentioned, we're often unaware of our biases. So how do I know if I have them to begin with? One thing we can do is take a test designed to measure these automatic links in our head. It's called the Implicit Associations Test, or IAT. You can Google Project Implicit or go to the website implicit.harvard.edu. And you can take a test designed to measure your implicit biases as it might relate to a whole host of things like mental health or careers. It's a computerized test. It just takes a few minutes to do. And when you take this test, your first inclination might be to disregard it, especially if it runs counter to what you feel your explicit beliefs are. Don't do that. I want to reassure you that this test was developed nearly 20 years ago by 2 social psychologists, Dr. Mazar Banaji, Dr. Anthony Greenwald. It's been found to reliably predict behavior. So instead of disregarding it, sit with it a little bit. And maybe do an audit of your behaviors. If you're a student, maybe you think about your science groups and if they're diverse. If you're a parent, maybe you think about the toys and books you provide your children. Are they science and math focused for your boys, but cooking and relationship focused for your girls? As teachers, maybe you ask a peer to come into your class to observe your teaching, to see if you call on boys and girls equally in class. And if you're an employer, maybe you do an assessment see if your procedures are as equitable and objective as possible. Do you set clear standards from the onset? And by doing these things, we can begin to see our blind spots, and we can take the second step, which is to challenge our biases. Our biases are like a smog. It's icky. We don't want to be exposed to it, but we all breathe in that toxic air, all of us, regardless of our identities. And if we act in line with our biases, we can actually make them true. Let me give you one concrete example of this. There was a study done by Rosenthal and Jacobson where they told elementary school teachers that on the basis of an IQ test, 20% of their students showed unusual potential for growth. And then they were provided with those students' names. In actuality, those students were selected at random with no relation to actual performance. And then they took an IQ test 8 months later. How did teachers' expectations affect actual performance? Those students who were thought to be smarter performed better. What likely happened in those 8 months? Those teachers provided those kids that they thought were smarter with more time, more attention. That led to greater confidence on the students' part, which translated to higher grades. In this case, bias was based on supposed performance on an IQ test. But biases could have been based on maybe perceptions of wealth, physical ability, size. Who do we automatically assume will fail or succeed? Our biases, well, this experiment powerfully shows that our biases we can actually make our biases true. While we like to think of our successes and our failures as purely the product of our effort or our abilities, biases affect outcomes. So how can we begin to challenge them? As I started this talk, I gave the example that we may have an automatic association with science as both white and male. We don't come out of the womb with that association. We learn them. We learn them as a product of our culture and our environment. If we learn them, we can unlearn them. But how do we unlearn them? One thing we can do is we can be more deliberate about what we feed our brains, what we expose ourselves to. We can offer ourselves opportunities, perhaps, to read a book from someone who comes from a different background than ourselves. It allows us to see a different perspective on the world and see someone in all their full humanity. Author S.I. Hayakawa captures this sentiment best when he says, "It's not true that we have only one life to live. If we can read, we can live as many more lives and as many kind of lives as we wish." In addition to that helping us gain perspective and seeing someone in all their humanity, it also allows us to see a different future for ourselves, especially if we've seen negative imagery for our own groups. When a little girl reads a story and that female protagonist is a scientist, she learns that she too can be a scientist. Imagine if our textbooks equally celebrated the contributions of diverse scientists. If our movies similarly captured the experience, whether they be fiction or nonfiction, of a diversity of scientists, and that was also true in our TV shows, we'd see the automatic association between science and white and male go away because of these diverse exemplars. And I want to note, it was really hard for me to capture this slide. As you can see with my TV examples, I couldn't think of anybody of people of color for those examples. We still have a long way to go in thinking about whose stories we tell. But these images matter. Research has found on the IAT that if someone had an automatic association with black and bad based on that test, but immediately before taking another IAT, they're shown positive exemplars of black people, people like Oprah, Colin Powell, Obama, that negative association weakens or goes away. In addition to what we expose our brain to via media, we can also think about meeting people who are different from ourselves. And not just one person, but many people. How often have we heard someone say, "I'm not a racist, my best friend is black"? Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And it doesn't work that way because one person can't represent the experience of an entire group of people. Knowing one person is a start, but just a start to challenging our biases. So as a last step, I want to encourage us to all have compassion as we take these steps towards creating a more inclusive world. When we start challenging our biases, we're going to make mistakes. That's inevitable. But without compassion for ourselves, we'll give up. We'll say it's just too hard. And I think what makes it hard to think about our failures is because of how we couch success and failure broadly. Psychologist Carol Dweck talks about how we frame our abilities as coming from one of two different camps. Either they're a product of innate or natural ability, what she calls a fixed mindset, or they're a product of learning and growth, what she calls a growth mindset. And our successes and our failures mean something different, depending on which lens we use to view them from. With a fixed mindset, our successes are easy. They confirm my belief that I'm naturally gifted. My failures, on the other hand, mean that I'm not naturally gifted. And more than that, I will never be good at something. With a growth mindset, our failures mean something more hopeful. With enough time and energy and effort, I can be better. Let's relate that back to bias. If we approach this from a fixed mindset perspective, when we make mistakes, we'll say, it's just who I am. But with a growth mindset perspective, I can leverage those mistakes to make better decisions in the future. And just as it's important to view my own behaviors with a growth mindset, it's important for how I view others' behaviors as well. Research by Dr. Anita Rattan and Carol Dweck has found that when I have a growth mindset, I'm more likely to step in when someone makes a biased response. And that, in turn, has found to lead to a reduction of biased behaviors in the future. Have you ever called someone a racist or a sexist? How did that work out for you? I can tell by the laughs, not very well. You're approaching that from a fixed mindset perspective. You're just saying that's who they are. But if you approach it from a growth mindset perspective and talk about the behavior that they can change, maybe say something like, when you said this, I heard or I felt, or can you explain a little bit more what you meant by? It's approaching it from a growth mindset perspective. And I guarantee you, they're going to hear that a lot better. I know that talking about our prejudices and biases is difficult. I've been researching and teaching on this topic for nearly 20 years. But what I hope my talk today has accomplished 3 things. 1, helping us acknowledge that we all have biases, so we can begin to be on the path of creating a more equitable world. And 2, providing you with some tangible tools so you know what to do once you're on that path. And 3, encouraging you to have a growth mindset, which will allow us to have more compassion for ourselves and others when we and they inevitably make mistakes. That will allow us to stay committed to that path. I know our biases can seem unsurmountable, a product of a lifetime of being inundated with media and images. But once we begin to see the powerful negative consequences our biases have for ourselves, for others, for the world, we are left with no other choice but to challenge them. And we can challenge them. If they are learned, they can be unlearned. And we may make mistakes along the way, but we can't afford to give up. It's simply too important. We all have our spheres of influence, places where we can make tangible differences today. And that might be our social circles, our family, our classrooms, our boardrooms, our universities. I want to share with you one of my spheres of influence. This is a picture of my little girl. And she may choose to be an astronaut one day or an astrophysicist, or she may choose to be a dancer. And I have a feeling in a couple of days from now, she might be both, a little astronaut in a tutu. But I want to open as many doors and possibilities for her as possible. We cannot afford to let our biases limit someone's potential or lead to poor decisions in our classrooms, our boardrooms, or day-to-day lives. I hope you'll join me as we work together and work, however imperfectly, towards the goal of creating a more inclusive world. The child hoping to be a scientist, the person just wanting a fair shot on the interview, the person needing to be seen in all their full humanity is depending on it. Thank you.